Hello there, this is Irina, historian and history teacher, and because you cannot really study history without language, here we are with another short talk on etymology. One of the main topics you'll find on my channel are contributions about Norse culture, especially religion, from a more academic perspective, so please do check them out and consider subscribing. I'm going to look at one of the hardest words in Germanic etymology now, and that word is none other than God. Yes, God. For centuries, English speakers believed that God is somehow related to good, and that doesn't come as a surprise. So God is called like this because he is good. And many lexicographers from the 17th and 18th century thought so, for example, Skinner or Johnson or Bailey, and wrote as such in their dictionaries. But it's safe to say that the two words have nothing to do with one another. The old root for good had a long vowel and God has a short one, and this difference can be trusted. Short and long vowels can alternate, but only according to certain rules, and one rule states that short and long O never meet in the same Germanic root. So the vocalic alternation, or ablaut as it is called in linguistics, basically traps the words, the vowels, into some kind of cages and determines them not to interact. All right, so this idea of a single omnipotent being called God is, as we know, present in monotheistic religions. But before people developed monotheistic religions, they passed to a stage known as animism in anthropology. And if we look at some contemporary tribes, we are still going to find it nowadays. So animism basically means that everything has a soul, all objects are thought to be animate, and European pagans or pre-Christian religions have traits of animism, but if we look carefully, they also tend to have some traits of monotheism, or at least henotheism. So that means that one god at some point tends to dominate the rest of the family of gods and goddesses. So you have Zeus, for example, in the Greek pantheon, and you also have Odin in the Scandinavian pantheon. Despite Christianization, pagans were far from losing faith in other omnipotent beings, or perhaps omnipotent is not the appropriate word here, supernatural. Although the myths that have come down to us are relatively late, so think about the collection of mythological poems known as the Poetic Edda, written in the 13th century, they still contain hints of prehistory. Odin's name comes from an adjective meaning enraged, over, and if you look at the way it's spelled in Old High German, Wotan, you're going to recognize, if you know some German, the word Wut, which means anger, so rage. He is the enraged one, and he has plenty of attributes. He is the lord of the hanged, he is the master of poetry, of knowledge, involved in battle magic, and so on. However, there are some other gods or names of gods suggesting that maybe before the Viking Age, or maybe perhaps maybe before the poets started making up their poems, there wasn't such a clear hierarchical image of how these gods functioned. Because the god Freyr, for example, means lord, and more importantly, the god Tyr, the one who gets his arm bitten off by the wolf Fenrir, comes from a root, tiwas in Proto-Germanic, which is cognate with Zeus in Greek and Deus in Latin, meaning shining or brightness. It's an old Indo-European word, Deus, which might suggest that perhaps at some point he was a more important god than Odin, although it's not very easy to confirm that theory. Anyway, the main family of gods in Norse are called the Asir, and the singular form will be Os. This comes from Proto-Germanic Amsus. It's also the name of a letter in the Elder Futhark alphabet, and we have many cognates for it in other Indo-European languages. For example, we have Ashura in Sanskrit, Ahu in Avestan, Hashush in Hittite, and they all come from a root meaning to beget, so to create. Greeks, Romans, and Scandinavians made their gods anthropomorphic, by the way. They endowed them with human bodies and characteristics, and you're going to find that everywhere in the stories where they fight among each other, they take revenge, they fall in love, they commit adultery, and so on and so forth. One important difference I've noticed between the two pantheons in Greek and Scandinavian would be the fact that in the ancient Greek one, gods seem to have been involved a lot with humans. They interacted much more with human beings than they did in Norse mythology. On the other hand, gods were not the only ones that mattered. From a very early stage of human existence, people believed they were surrounded by spirits, all kinds of spirits everywhere. So not necessarily somebody watching upon you from the skies. And these spirits were everywhere, and they could be benevolent, and they could also inflict diseases upon you, and because they feared these agents, they also tried to please them. There isn't much known about this early stage of religion, but we can catch a glimpse about it in myths and folklore. If you look in the Scandinavian case, for example, alongside Freud and Odin and Thor, you're going to encounter a multitude of other creatures, so from elves and dwarves and giants to trolls and nature spirits and that kind of stuff. And about nature spirits, the Landvættir, I made a video recently, so please feel free to check that out as well. So what I'm trying to say here is that there was some division and categories among all these beings, but perhaps the border between them were not as clearly defined as we want it to be. And there wasn't really a being with this supreme meaning we tend to associate the word God with. The Greek for what we today consider God was theos, and you have in English theology, for example, and you also have the word enthusiasm. So being enthusiastic basically means ecstasy, poetic inspiration, being touched by a glimpse of madness. And if you look closer, there is a strong relationship to Odin's attributes here as well. The word is, by the way, related to the Latin festus, not deus. The root is different. Theos has something to do with a root meaning occupying a place, in this case, a sacred space. So our main problem is not only to find the meaning of the ancient root of the word God, but also understand what the word once meant and how it was possible to rise in importance above many other designations for supernatural spirits. The word God does not show up in early runic inscriptions. It does show up in the Gothic Bible. This was translated in the 4th century from Greek, and the translator, Bishop Ulfila, needed an equivalent for theos. And by the way, I also have a video about the Gothic language. So he found this word as guth, spelled with the letter thorn, as in the English th. And he also needed a word for temple, and he coined the compound guthus, spelled this time with a D. Now, the Gothic word occurs in contraction as G and Th, with a horizontal stroke over it, and well, we cannot be quite sure which vowel stood before G and Th, but if we compare it with many other words such as God-fearing and so on, it appears to have been indeed U. Interestingly enough, except in the text of the Bible, where it referred to the Christian God and was therefore masculine, in Old Icelandic, for example, this word occurred in the plural. So while masculine nouns in Gothic ended in S, and Old Icelandic masculine nouns ended in R, you can see that Guth doesn't and never had an R or an S. So the gods in the neuter plural are often mentioned in both the poetic and the prose Edda, and there is this distinction between the two families, the Asir and the Vanir. So in this case, if you wanted to single out one god, it was either an Os or a Vanir in the masculine form. The ancient speakers of Germanic languages thus appear to have had the word for gods, but used it mainly in the neuter plural, and in this sense we can compare it to the Latin word numen, and something divine, and the plural numina. In other words, the Goths and Scandinavians abstracted the singular from the neuter plural, turned it into a masculine noun, but allowed it to remain without an ending. If the plural was needed when speaking about idols, so what was after Christianization considered false gods, Wulfila coined a noun for it as well, galliga guth, a collective noun with gas, a collective prefix, and yuga, the verb to lie. And he seems to have preferred to use this letter th for the name of God and d elsewhere. In Icelandic, there were two forms which competed, goth and guth, the alternation reflecting some differences in pronunciation between the two dialects. From a grammatical point of view now, if you look at this word, it looks like an ancient past participle consisting of the root ku and an ending the. The meaning of the word is unclearer than other words for God, so than, for example, the Slavic bog. Speaking of which, this word cognates with the Sanskrit bhaga, meaning wealth, and a Western bhaga, which means to share, and it suffered a change in meaning during the Proto-Slavic Iranian contacts, so coming from wealth to wealth provider, and then ultimately to the one providing everything, and God. Old Germanic guth certainly existed, but we don't really know what it meant when it was coined centuries before we have it in texts. And for this, we have several Sanskrit and Greek verbs which might come in handy, meaning to pour. These were often used to explain the etymology of God. So we have, for example, the Sanskrit juhota, cognate with the Greek keo, Latin fundere, and then coming to Gothic, we have the word jutan. We also have in modern German gießen, and maybe also the English gush can be related to it as well. So the question arising is, what could God have to do with pouring? Well, quite a lot actually. Think about, for example, the pouring of the blood of sacrificial animals, which is why there were some linguists which translated God as being the libated one. So it is possible that a collective neuter form of this Germanic word could refer to some kind of spirit, immanent spirit residing perhaps the burial mounds known as kurgans, the characteristic burial mounds associated with Indo-Europeans. Or you can think of libation as in offering a drink, so that the libated one can be understood as the recipient of a libation of a sacrifice. So let's not forget in this case that the Germanic protoform appears to be a past participle. What is fascinating is the fact that jutan, the verb to pour, is also related to the ethnonym Goths. Goti, as their non-Germanic neighbors called Goths, and all over the place we can find Gautar, for example, Yatas in Beowulf, and other tribes whose names appear to be derived from the same root. And this idea of pouring turning up in ethnic names with quite some regularity is a bit strange. So this connection with them as being some kind of pourers, or the ones performing sacrifices to gods by pouring, I'm not very sure about it, because they weren't really the only ones doing it, and the term seems to be extremely general. So maybe there was something in Gothic mythology that was lost and we don't really know much about. On the other hand, not long ago, another Sanskrit root, a similar one but a different one, meaning to invoke, was more often believed to be at the basis of this Germanic divine name. An attempt was once made to merge the two roots, but modern researchers discovered that there were too many phonetic difficulties to do that. So some linguists thought that in this context, a being invoked by worshippers actually made more sense than a libated one. According to scholar Anatoly Lieberman, being invoked or being the recipient of offerings did not characterize any group uniquely, and in general, to call God the libated one is very strange, is almost like trying to coin a divine name related to candles or smoke or incense. Also, the etymology has to account for the universal use of such words in the plural. So I find his remark actually a very, very relevant one. The Latin numen mentioned earlier, we can also add the Hebrew Elohim. So maybe we need a group name to designate this whole story. In Old Icelandic, by the way, the gods, the great gods altogether, were called not only Guð but also Regin. And Regin would mean something like the ruling forces, and it is indeed neutral plural. Then we have the word meaning holy. In Old English, Halik, consecrated, sacred. This comes from the Proto-Germanic root Heilaga. It's also the source of Old Norse Heilager, or Old Frisian Hellig. Yeah, many other words in Germanic, Heilags in Gothic, and so on and so forth. This comes from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning whole and uninjured, and then we have in another Proto-Germanic root to hallow, to consecrate, and this root you can see in the Christmas name in German, Weihnachten, weihen, yeah, to hallow, to consecrate. And none of these words appear to have been good enough for all the Germanic speakers to designate a new cult. And the same linguist Anatoly Lieberman points out that maybe this has to do with another root, and he highlights here the word in Sanskrit koras, which means horrible, having to do with the English gore. However, taking theos out of the equation does not damage the credibility of God. So this root might have been a sound imitative complex like boo, booing, or hooing. So in this case, God would have meant something like terror, a divinity striking fear in the worshippers. So very far away from the initial thought of God being good, like a good entity. If this is how the Germanic word for God came into existence, it means it wasn't a past participle. And last but not least, the same scholar draws a connection to the English boogie and the Russian buka with the meaning specter or goblin or wraith, or at any rate something in the area. So it basically comes down to how the new converts might have interpreted the new god. As somebody worthy of invoking, or as somebody meant to inspire fear, or yeah, something in between. All right, so I'm sorry I don't have a definitive answer to this question. I tried to point out the main theories regarding this word. It would make sense to me to have this meaning of the libated one, so somebody you make sacrifices for, but at the same time, it also makes a lot of sense to associate God with fear and this general awe, and which is why it's very difficult to determine exactly what these people thought when concocting this word. So finally, the etymology of God doesn't really have to do with the determining the essence of such entity, but to giving a clue to why God is actually called God. All right, that was it from me. If you know other words in other languages which are also maybe strange or problematic, or at any rate interesting, having to do with the divine beings, with God in particular, Please feel free to share in a comment, and hope you enjoyed the information you found here. If you did, consider subscribing and finding out more about the Germanic and Norse world. Thank you very much for listening. This was Irina. Have a great day, and until next time.